What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the macro developments coming out of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you watching for the first time, if that is something you are interested in, and if you want to be just as informed as my clients, maybe consider subscribing. Everyone else, it's been a bit of a crazy week, guys, but I hope you guys have been well, wherever you are. This is being filmed on Friday, and hopefully I can try and get it up on Friday night or Saturday night. Hopefully it won't be as late as last week, so I'll try and get that up tonight. I am here this weekend, so it shouldn't be a problem. This week I've decided to do something a little bit different than usual. China's had a very busy week, to put it mildly, and there have been three major exchanges that I wanted to look at specifically in this episode. So this is going to be a very international, foreign policy focused episode of China Update. The first was the Alaska meeting between the Chinese side and the US side. The second has been the to and fro from the Chinese side and the EU side. And the third was a special meeting between the Chinese side and the Russian side. Now, as always, if you enjoy the episode, don't forget to smash the like button. This is sensitive-ish sort of material, and so YouTube is not at the forefront of suggesting the material. So the best way to actually get this out there for people to watch is to like and subscribe and share. It's a huge help. And as always, thank you so much to my Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. Thank you for supporting a small YouTube channel like this. It's always very much appreciated. Now, with all that said and done, let's jump into this week's China Update. Now, last weekend was the much anticipated US-China-Alaska meeting between Secretary Yang Jiechi and Minister Wang and the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. The public side of the meeting was quite tense. The traditional opening few minutes of greetings and remarks dissolved into more than an hour of very public rhetorical confrontation. In the public exchange, both sides were essentially speaking to a domestic audience, with the US side likely also signaling messaging to key allies watching the meeting as well. PRC's top diplomat Yang Jiechi had a few likely pre-planned zingers in his remarks, which blew up on the increasingly patriotic Chinese internet. Online and all around me here, people were talking all about it the day that it happened. Some of these phrases that Yang Jiechi said at this meeting were printed on mugs and shirts, phone cases, and even baijiu, alcohol, and sold like wildfire in the mainland. These included, quote, "We thought too highly of you. 我们把你们想得太好了." Or, quote, "The United States is not qualified to say what it wants to say to China in such a condescending manner," end quote. 你们在中国面前没有资格说你们从实力地位出发同中国谈话. Or the very simple, "This is not acceptable to the Chinese people. 中国人不吃这一套." Apart from a lot of words and rhetoric, primarily for domestic audiences, very little substance or progress in US-China relations came from the public part of this meeting. The statements from both sides claim that more constructive conversations were made in private. Quote, "We were also able to have a very candid conversation over these many hours on an expansive agenda, on Iran, on North Korea, on Afghanistan, on climate. Our interests intersect. On economics, on trade, on technology. We told our counterparts that we are revising these issues with close consultation with Congress, with our allies and partners." Quote, "The two sides agreed to follow the spirit of the Xi-Biden telephone conversation on February 11 to maintain dialogue and communication, conduct mutually beneficial cooperation, avoid misunderstanding and misjudgment, forestall conflict and confrontation, and promote sound and steady development of China-US relations." End quote. Yuan Peng, president of the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, was also quite optimistic, saying in an interview this week, quote, "Through meeting and communicating, China and the United States clearly and accurately demonstrated their respective political positions and at the same time conducted frank and in-depth exchanges on major issues in their internal affairs, diplomacy, and bilateral relations. These are undoubtedly meaningful." End quote. I am not as optimistic as Yuan Peng here. I still expect a confrontational US-China relationship to continue, and it still may well worsen at this point. Now, while we are on US-China, let's have a quick trade deal update. This week, a Bloomberg analysis of official Chinese or PRC data estimates total purchases of US agricultural, manufactured, and energy goods were $123 billion in the 14 months since the signing of the so-called Phase 1 trade agreement in January of last year, January 2020, between the Trump administration and the PRC. This was only 32.6% of the target of 378 billion for the years 2020 and 2021. This may well put more strain on the trade relationship. Now let's move on to EU-China. Earlier this week, the PRC announced sanctions on 10 EU individuals and their family members and 4 entities, including the European Council's Political and Security Commission, which is made up of 27 ambassadors, and the German think tank MERICS, MERICS. These PRC sanctions came just before the announcement of coordinated sanctions by the US, UK, Canada, and EU over the situation in Xinjiang. Quote, the European Union imposed unilateral sanctions on relevant Chinese individuals and entity on March 22, citing the so-called human rights issues in Xinjiang. This move is based on nothing but lies and disinformation. The individuals concerned and their families are prohibited from entering the mainland, Hong Kong, and Macau of China. They and companies and institutions associated with them are also restricted from doing business with China. It seemed in 2020 at least that a key objective of the PRC was to prevent the EU and US working together to respond to the PRC. This decision to implement counter sanctions seems to undermine that objective and suggests that 1, it's not as important and objective as previously thought. 2, the PRC believes it can still achieve this objective. Or 3, policymakers in Beijing have made a miscalculation. This move from the PRC is likely going to alienate pro-engagement voices in the business community of the EU and push many that were on the fence before more towards a confrontational approach in coalition with the US, Japan, India, and other actors. The Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, or CAI, which was agreed to by the EU and the PRC late last year, may be in trouble. Quote, the ratification process cannot be separated from the evolving dynamics of the wider EU-China relationship. The prospects for the CAI's ratification will depend on how the situation evolves. End quote. Both France and Germany have summoned their respective Chinese ambassadors to express disappointment with the counter-sanctions. Quote, we wanted to make it very, very clear that the EU sanctions target individuals who have violated human rights, and that sanctions against legislators and scholars are totally unacceptable to us. End quote. In response to pushback from the EU, the PRC has doubled down. Quote, the EU only allows itself to wantonly smear and attack others and impose sanctions based on false information, but it does not allow China to talk back or fight back. This is in itself a manifestation of double standards, bullying, and hypocrisy. End quote. State media this week is also engaged in a media blitz with daily articles on the, quote, human rights violations of the EU, end quote, which has included references to the Holocaust. Apparel brands, H&M, Nike, Adidas, or Adidas, where I come from, and others have also been pulled into a domestic media shitstorm too, and will likely face damaged business in the mainland and organized boycotts for, quote, taking the wrong side on the Xinjiang issue, end quote. Veteran US-based China consultant Bill Bishop observed on Friday, quote, the PRC may have done more in the last 4 days to damage PRC-EU relations in very deep ways than anything the Biden administration could have done. Some may argue that perhaps other countries should be the ones seeking good relations with the PRC and not the other way around. After all, the China market is huge and is not something one should sacrifice. For example, the Global Times this week observed, quote, H&M, Nike and others are now suffering heavy losses to their reputations in the Chinese market. Enormous investment in public relations have been destroyed instantly. And in a separate article, the same publication expressed, quote, China is the EU's biggest trading partner. Take a look at how many German cars there are on the streets of China, how many French and Italian fashion products are being used by Chinese women. Goes on to say, how could these ignorant politicians in the European Parliament possibly feel they are entitled to threaten China by not approving the CAI, end quote. Okay, so while the Chinese consumer market is large in absolute terms, as a percentage of GDP, it's actually quite small. In fact, the EU consumer market is about 50% bigger than the People's Republic of China, and the US consumer market is almost 3 times as big. What drives many trade surpluses with China is actually commodities sales, which has fueled China's massive infrastructure construction over the last few decades. And this demand will very likely reduce in coming years, at any rate, due to concern with unsustainable debt accumulation. While we're on this topic, it's important to remember as well that while this is being framed both in the PRC and by some in the Western media as a PRC versus West dispute, actually concern among China's Asian neighbors, or some of China's Asian neighbors, is more acute and has been for longer. For example, this week a group of Japanese lawmakers, co-led by former Defense Minister Gen Nakatani of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party and Shiori Yamao of the opposition Democratic Party, announced that they are seeking to, quote, craft legislation to enable sanctions over human rights abuses in China, end quote. There have also been similar calls in India this week to do the same. Okay guys, before we jump into Russia, I just wanted to have a quote of the week, and let's move away from foreign affairs and look at something domestic and economic. One of my a very popular voice that I like to turn to, of course, is Professor of Finance at my alma mater, Peking University, Professor Michael Pettis, and this is what he observed about the Chinese regulators' challenges in the mainland when it comes to housing prices. This is what he said this week, quote, "The decline in property values in China's third-tier cities seems to weigh heavy on the ability of residents to spend money. This isn't yet happening in first and second-tier cities, but as property prices continue to rise to ever more unrealistic levels, regulators are in an incredibly tough position. They can't allow property prices to continue rising because that makes a reversal all the more likely and all the more damaging. They can't allow property prices to fall because this would set off a significant reversal of whatever rebalancing had been achieved and the need for another surge in public sector debt. And they can't stabilize property prices because it is only the perception of rising prices that prevent them from falling." End quote. On March 22 this week, the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, held a symposium in which housing price stability was a key concern. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited the PRC this week with a special meeting with Foreign Minister Wang and other top officials. The US and the recent sanctions were front and center in public statements. Quote, "The international situation is undergoing profound changes, with new centers of economic, financial, and political influence growing stronger. However, these objective developments, which are leading to the formation of a truly multipolar and democratic world, are unfortunately being hindered by Western countries, particularly the United States." End quote. State media gave a glowing picture of the Russo-China meeting. Quote, "China on Monday hailed the positive comments made by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, reaffirming the cooperation between China and Russia needs to forge ahead firmly as the world is increasingly unstable. It is the United States who wantonly interferes in other countries' internal affairs in the name of so-called democracy and human rights, and has become the source of turbulence and chaos after making so many troubles in the world. China and Russia always stand together and back each other firmly in the fight against hegemony and bullying." End quote. At the end of the meeting, Russians and the Chinese governments made a joint statement. Quote, "We call on the international community to put aside differences, build consensus, strengthen cooperation, safeguard world peace and geostrategic stability, and promote the construction of a more just, democratic and rational multipolar international order." End quote. Okay guys, that's this week's China update. Hopefully you guys are getting this on Friday night or Saturday night. Fingers crossed. Wherever you are, I hope you're staying safe, staying sane. Throw your comments below. I always love to hear from you guys. I will see you guys next time on China Update.